Welkom, we gaan beginnen. Na enige strubbelingen met PowerPoints. Ik heet jullie in ieder geval allemaal van harte welkom en bedankt voor jullie komst. Ik zal me even voorstellen, ik ben Emiel het Hart. In het dagelijks leven heb ik een bedrijf wat een toeleverancier is voor onder andere e-sigaretten naar de Nederlandse retail. Maar ik sta hier natuurlijk als voorzitter van de e-sigaretbond. Even kort, de e-sigaretbond zelf is een organisatie die voor de belangen van de e-sigaretten opkomt. De leden zijn sigarettenwinkels of e-sigaretwinkels, vape-stores, een stukje industrie. Eigenlijk een mengeling van alles. En we hebben de afgelopen jaren regelmatig met Den Haag aan tafel gezeten om regulering te bespreken en te doen. Dat is allemaal prima, dat houden we natuurlijk van. Want regels horen bij ons product. Vinden we ook geen probleem. We begrijpen ook het hele anti-rookbeleid wat in Nederland wordt gevoerd. We begrijpen het niet helemaal. En dat is een van de redenen waarom we hier staan. Omdat wij vinden dat een e-sigaret een middel is die kan helpen tegen roken. En nu wordt het geclassificeerd als een sigaret. Sterker nog, wordt hetzelfde behandeld als een sigaret. Dus het anti-rookbeleid begrijpen we wel, maar de e-sigaret verdient een plek in het anti-rookbeleid. En dat is nu niet het geval. Het is in principe het is ook een prima middel, want het is een goed middel om te stoppen met roken. Of het is in ieder geval een goed alternatief. En in beide gevallen is er een enorme gezondheidswinst te halen hiermee. Want het is op het moment dat iemand niet rookt, dus geen sigarettenrook binnenkrijgt, is dat winst. Hoe dan ook. In het buitenland kijken ze er ook heel anders naar. Dat is ook de reden waarom we hier 3 experts hebben zitten die een stukje van het buitenland gaan toelichten. En met een leuk nieuwtje nog. Ik las vanmorgen in de krant dat er ondertussen 3 miljoen Britten zijn overgestapt van traditioneel roken naar vapen. Ja, ik zeg dat zijn fantastische cijfers. Ik denk dat iedereen in Den Haag hier die enigszins geeft om volksgezondheid, daar moet naar kijken. En jammer genoeg zijn er maar weinig mensen uit de politiek aanwezig. We hopen dat we met videobeelden deze mensen wel kunnen bereiken. Vandaag wordt het verder gesprek wordt gevoerd door meneer Simon Roosendaal. Een wetenschappelijk journalist. Waarschijnlijk kennen we hem al wel. Hij heeft enigszins een bekend gezicht. I'd like to talk to dear Lynn, Carl, Jacques, thank you very much for being here. It's an honor to have you and that you are willing to share the information and research you have done over the past years. It's great to have you. So, Simon, take it away.
Thank you, Emiel. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to chair this meeting, the discussion. To introduce myself, I'm a science writer, a chemist by education. I've written several times about e-cigarettes and also Heat Not Burn in the Dutch weekly Elsevier Weekblad. I'm not a smoker myself. I never smoked cigarettes. I never smoked e-cigarettes or Heat Not Burn. But I've witnessed around me that several people who were staunch smokers for 20, 25 years were able to get away from tobacco with the help of either e-cigarettes or Heat Not Burn. And it's an interesting time to have this discussion. This week, you know, the New York Times had this advertisement by Philip Morris. We are going to quit with tobacco. How about you? And also there's a big discussion in the United States initiated by the Food and Drug Administration that there is a so-called vaping problem in the US. So it's interesting, and I'm very glad that we have 3 excellent speakers from abroad. You will have the floor for about 20 minutes with a little bit of spillover, and after that there will be plenty of room for discussion. So, without further ado, Dr. Carl Erik Lund from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, something like the RIVM in the Netherlands. You all know that, and he has about 30 years in experience in tobacco control. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Simon, and thank you very much, Emil. Good morning to you all. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, that's right. I'm gonna like to present for you some thoughts on tobacco harm reduction, how that could be a supplementary strategy to reduce smoking-related diseases in the Netherlands and also elsewhere. As a researcher at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, I have been working on tobacco harm reduction for the last 10 years, more than 30 years in tobacco control research. But first, I have to, congratulate you for your tobacco control policy. According to an WHO ranking, Netherlands makes a pretty good score on programs for monitoring, cessation programs, mass media campaigns, etc. So overall, the picture for tobacco control is quite positive. And Netherlands is also ranked among the top 10 countries in Europe for its infrastructure on tobacco control. Placed here, as we can see, between Norway and Sweden. However, in spite of your tobacco control measures, the Dutch smoking prevalence continued to be very high, meaning that 1 in 4 adults being a current smoker. Moreover, according to the American Cancer Society, you have more than 2.7 million smokers, and the annual number of smoking-related deaths is 30,000. So smoking continued to be a huge problem in the Netherlands, even though the Dutch Cancer Society has put forward a very ambitious goal of a smoke-free society within 2040. A zero vision. Smoking is to be obsolete, phased out, eliminated. And the zero vision of a smoke-free society has long been a goal in all the Nordic countries, with varying dates of the final extinction of smoking. Now, I have taken the effort of reading all these strategy plans for the different countries. It's kind of perverse, I know, but I have done that. It appears that the zero vision will be achieved by intensifying the use of traditional means, meaning that more information, stronger regulations, higher taxes, more campaigns, increased assistance to smoking cessation. And that is all very well. Most of us support that kind of policy. However, these efforts will be put into societies where the infrastructure of tobacco control is pretty advanced already. So the plan is to put more information into populations that are already well informed, put in place stronger regulations in societies that are already fairly well regulated, rise the taxes into markets where cigarettes are pretty expensive already, release more campaigns into cultures where smoking already is pretty denormalized, and put up additional quit smoking clinics, even though the present capacity is underutilized, at least in my country. So the zero vision is to be achieved by turning the wise another round. However, we have to expect marginal returns for tightening up the wise in this way, leaving us with a situation where we can expect decreasing effect from these traditional anti-smoking tools. And moreover, most of the recommendations from the WHO are in place already, so the toolbox is getting empty. But still, smoking continues to be a huge problem, as we have seen. And then again, we have also to take into consideration that the smokers of today are more resistant and possess other characteristics than those we addressed with traditional tools some decades ago. The smoker doesn't look like this anymore. They're not sophisticated. They're not young and well-dressed persons, not the GPs smoke anymore, not the athletes. To be painfully brutal, the smokers of today have more in common with these people. I could have shown you a lot of statistics that would have emphasized my point here, that the smokers have gone through a social class descent. Smoking has become a deviant behavior smokers of today may not possess the same coping skills than the smokers we addressed some decades ago and has already quit. So the remaining smokers are perhaps more stigmatized and isolated, which leads us to one of the target groups for tobacco harm reduction, the established smokers unable or unwilling to quit nicotine. And for this group, tobacco harm reduction would enable them with an opportunity to reduce their own risk of tobacco-related disease by informing, facilitating, and encouraging transition to risk-reduced nicotine products. Even though use of these products might cause exposure to toxins and continued nicotine addiction and periods of dual use. So that is one target group, the established smokers. Moreover, tobacco harm reduction would also mean to target youth susceptible of tobacco use. That is, make alternative nicotine products available to potential smokers. You know, the bad guys involved in risk-taking behaviors. Even though these products might also attract users from a segment of youth who otherwise would have been nicotine abstinent. You know, the good guys here. The good guys who spend their time at home doing their homework, eager to achieve, and conforms to whatever they are told by the parents. So that leaves us with the three most affected groups here. The established smokers, the bad guys who might otherwise smoke, and the good guys who might otherwise be totally nicotine-free. And for the rest of my presentation, I'm going to juggle with these three groups a little bit. But first, we have to define what kind of products will go into the arsenal of tobacco harm reduction products. The nicotine market is changing very, very fast these days, but at present, the three most relevant products for tobacco harm reduction are e-cigarettes, of course, in all shapes and variants. We have snus, you may have heard of that, low nitrosamine smokeless tobacco product that is very prevalent in Norway and Sweden. It's currently been banned in the EU for reasons I personally find hard to understand, given the very positive experience we've had with snus in Scandinavia for some decades now. And of course, the heat-not-burn products, the IQOS, where tobacco is heated but not burned. I think it's a kind of a hybrid between e-cigarette and tobacco cigarette. I'm gonna not go in detail of risk aspects of these products. I leave that for Jack and Lynn. But the evidence is accumulating. We have now toxicological, we have cytotoxic, we have clinical, and for snus also we have epidemiological studies indicating a huge risk difference compared to cigarettes. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Royal College of Physicians estimate of e-cigarettes making up only 5% of the risk when compared to cigarettes. And even if this estimate is disputed, a lot of reports have evaluated now e-cigarettes, and there is a medical consensus, I think we have to say, of a huge risk difference. And this is also the case in this country, where the RIVM Institute, in one of their reports, also acknowledged that the available information showed that e-cigarettes, H&B, and snus are less harmful alternatives to conventional cigarettes. So, what would tobacco harm reduction look like when converted into practical, real-world policy in the Netherlands? Well, basically 3 steps. First of all, making the products available for consumers. But the case in the Netherlands is that snus is banned, while e-cigarettes and heat-not-burn products are available. But if I understood the situation correct, there is an imminent possibility that these products are to be regulated much in the same way as cigarettes under the Tobacco Act. The second step in the tobacco harm reduction policy would be for the health authorities to disseminate accurate information on the risk difference between smoking and vaping. Correct perception of the risk difference could motivate smokers to switch. However, in a comprehensive review conducted by some very fine Dutch researchers, concluded that the smokers seem to get more and more misinformed about these things. They concluded that while more recent studies, e-cigarettes were perceived as equally or more harmful than cigarettes among adult cigarette smokers. And that is supported by data from the UK, showing that there is a declining minority of current smokers believe that e-cigarettes are less harmful than cigarettes, and an increasing proportion believe that they are equally harmful. In my own research, I have found that smokers typically assess the risk from e-cigarettes to make up 60 or 70% of the risk from cigarettes. And for snus, it was even worse. And this is, of course, very inconsistent with medical experts who place e-cigarettes and snus way down on the risk continuum, approximately 5%. So it is kind of a thought pollution out there. Accurate information is needed badly. Now, the third element of a tobacco harm reduction policy would be to implement risk proportionate regulation. To be more precise, taxation that reflects the risk difference and also allow e-cigarettes some competitive advantages over combustibles on the nicotine market. So there you go. Make harm reduction, reducing nicotine products available, inform smokers about risk difference, and make the products attractive and allow them competitive advantages and risk proportionate regulation. Step 1, 2, and 3. And while implementing step 1 and 2, the authorities could at the same time strengthen the regulation on tobacco cigarettes and smoking, tax hikes, plain packs, display ban, total advertising bans, flavor restrictions, and bans on indoor smoking. And this will make smoking even more inconvenient. And to avoid being cooked alive here in the boiler, the smokers will look for alternatives. They want out, looking for convenient escape routes. And if alternatives are made available and attractive to smokers, it will, for the authorities, be easier to justify strong anti-smoking measures. And moreover, if alternatives are available, the authorities will gain increased effect from their anti-smoking measures. Now, if you, on the other hand, ban these alternatives from the market, you let the huge misconceptions on risk difference pass without trying to correct them. And you regulate them in the same way as cigarettes. Then you will deprive the smokers from a motive to switch. I mean, they might then as well keep on smoking if e-cigarettes are equally expensive, presented in the same unattractive wrapping as cigarettes. They are not on display in the shops. They can't be used indoors. They come in a few flavors, and they're perceived to be equally harmful. Why should they then switch? They might as well switch back to smoking tobacco cigarettes. And for the bad guys, the youth susceptible for tobacco use, they might just as well choose cigarettes instead of e-cigarettes if these products are treated more or less in the same way by the authorities. The skepticism by authorities in many countries towards tobacco harm reduction policy is based on a concern that e-cigarettes might also become attractive to the good guys, the youth who otherwise would have refrained from all kinds of nicotine use. So in order to keep the good guys away from nicotine use, the authorities impose strong restrictions and want to reduce the attractiveness of the product. And moreover, such a policy is also aiming to make present vapers quit all nicotine use. All kinds of recreational nicotine use is considered to be bad. So what I have been trying to do in my research for the past years is to find a framework where we could weigh the pros and the cons for implementing a tobacco harm reduction policy. How can we weigh the potential advantages among the established smokers and the bad guys against the potential adverse effects among the good guys? What will the net effect be on public health from a tobacco harm reduction policy? And the answer is to be deducted from these three questions. That is, what is the excess risk from the use of these products compared to non-use? That we call the absolute risk. What is the risk reduction compared to continued smoking, the relative risk? And most importantly, what is the relationship between smokers and non-smokers and never smokers in the use of this product? That is what we call the user configuration. To put this in a more educational way, what we are asking is this. Now, given the anticipated risk difference in relation to cigarettes, how many of the good guys will have to pick up e-cigarettes in order to offset the health gain from each established smoker or bad guy who start to vape instead of smoke cigarettes? And now we're moving into what in the literature is called the risk-use equilibrium. The point of departure here in the risk-use equilibrium is that we have an anticipated harm from e-cigarettes in relation to tobacco cigarettes, say 5%. E-cigarettes make up 5% of the harm from cigarettes. Then you have one person who switched from smoking to vaping, then reducing his probability for a smoking-related disease to 5% of what he would have had as a continued smoker. Then 20 never smokers will have to pick up e-cigarettes in order to balance out the health gain from the one who switched, leaving the public health effect unchanged. Let's be even more educational here. Let's say that during this seminar, one smoker will decide to swap cigarettes for e-cigarettes and succeed permanently, and by that reduce his risk of a smoking-related disease to 5% of what he would have had as a continued smoker. But during this seminar, also a number of never smokers also considered to start vaping. So the question again is, how many of the good guys will have to start vaping to offset the health gain from the one that swapped cigarettes with e-cigarettes? And if the risk of vaping makes up 5% of the risk from smoking, the answer is 20. But in the real world, like in Great Britain, if Great Britain is a part of the real world, is it? I think hard to tell these days. In the real world, never smokers make up a minority of the vapers, only 4% in the UK. The majority consists of smokers trying to quit or cut down on their cigarettes and former smokers who have switched totally. And this seems to be the pattern in all countries, probably also in the Netherlands. So the user configuration indicates very strongly that these products might produce a net benefit to public health. The risk is lower than for cigarettes, and most users are smokers. And in fact, we have several empirical observations that point in the direction of a positive net effect for public health. We have some data from Japan, seeing that heat not burn is competing very well on the nicotine market with cigarettes. Lynn will in a minute show you how e-cigarettes have been competing with cigarettes in the UK market. But the strongest empirical evidence comes from Scandinavia, where snus has been on the market for decades and made a huge impact on public health. Among youth in Norway, there is a strong inverse correlation between smoking and snus use. Youth are picking up snus instead of cigarettes, and such a rapid decline in youth smoking has not been seen elsewhere in Europe, I believe. In the late 1990s, snus made up only 5% of the nicotine market, but now snus count close to 40% of the tobacco consumed. And during the same time, the overall tobacco consumption has been reduced by 40%. So snus has come instead of cigarettes, not in addition to cigarettes. And in Sweden, where snus has even a longer history than in Norway, smoking rates are down to 5%, far below the other EU countries. And the low prevalence of smoking in these countries is, of course, partly caused by a strong tobacco control policy. But the policy related to it is really no different from that in the policy here and there is not really different from up in the Netherlands here. You have the smoking prevalence up here and they have the tobacco control score here. So Norway and Sweden are the outliers here, and it's quite obvious that low smoking rates in these two countries, it can be attributed to availability to nicotine alternative, snus. And when we study the health endpoints, such as lung cancer among men, Sweden have extraordinarily low mortality rate, much lower, right? Thanks. Much lower than France and Germany and US, where they set fire to the tobacco. Have a look at these numbers from the WHO. This is the death rates from smoking-related disease in Sweden compared to Europe. And although the per capita consumption of tobacco is similar in Sweden, men have mortality rates from lung cancer and cardiovascular disease that are less than 1/3 of the European average. And that's because more than 60% of tobacco is consumed as snus and not cigarettes. Here's the number for Netherlands. And again, 3 times higher than those in Sweden. And this is quite unnecessary. So to conclude, I would like to stress that it's quite unnecessary that smokers, and also potential smokers, should risk their life for their nicotine dose. Because for the first time in the, well, let's say 150 years of history of smoking, there are no low-risk alternatives available on the nicotine market that can compete with cigarettes. So to politicians, I would like to say that where users have a range of options to get their nicotine dose, regulation should facilitate transition to products with reduced risk. Make them available, correct misperceptions and risk, and implement regulation that is proportionate to risk. This will definitely produce a net benefit to public health. And to those present from the tobacco controlled community, I would say, yes, it is difficult for us in the tobacco control community to realize and to acknowledge that e-cigarettes and snus probably have greater potential to make smoking obsolete than the regulations we have spent a lifetime fighting for. But still, we have to learn to feel less and think more rationally about tobacco harm reduction. Thank you. You've been very patient. This is my disclosures. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lund. One technical question. Is snus something like chew tobacco?
Not really. Not really chew tobacco. Snus is kind of a moist tobacco. It's powder. You put it in your upper lip, and nicotine will be absorbed through lesions in the mouth. Well, chewing tobacco is kind of, that was for old fishermen and farmers. Snus is now, well, it's very popular, as I showed you, among the youth. So it's different.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is from Brittany. Dr. Jacques Lehouzec. You can see it from his name. Typiquement Breton. But he told me he is more known in the UK than in his own country. And he is an independent consultant in public health. Does it work? Okay, great. Okay, problem. Okay, bonne chance.
Merci. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to talk today. I've been in this field for more than 30 years. I quit smoking 34 years ago, almost 35 in November. I still know the date. And I then started a PhD thesis on nicotine. So it's been my field for my whole life. I'm also a smoking cessation specialist, because in 1986 in France, we started to train physicians, nurses, etc., all the health professionals to smoking cessation. And I've been training many smoking cessation specialists since then in different universities in France. The problem to me is that we took the wrong way. Most smokers don't feel ill if they have not yet a tobacco-related disease. They just are smokers. It's a behavior for them. It's not a disease. So most smokers will not go through a health system to quit smoking. They will try on their own with no help. That's what I did 5 years ago, because there was no treatment at the time. But most smokers today are still doing the same. Nicotine replacement works very well if you know how to use it, and if smokers accept to use the correct dose for the correct time. Most of the time they are underdosed and they don't use it long enough. So basically, the impact of nicotine replacement therapy and other smoking cessation drugs has been very little in many countries, except maybe UK, because UK did a lot starting from early 2000. But it's not the case, for example, in my own country, in France. Michael Russell was a pioneer in our field. I had the privilege to know him, and he was visionary. He had a vision. He was the first to say that smokers are smoking for nicotine, but they die from tar, or they die from the combustion. But also, he was already early in the 1990s thinking that the only way to get rid of tobacco smoking would be to propose to smokers an alternative to smoking, and not only short-term smoking cessation. To me, from what I've seen published in the scientific community, but also by working on the field, I spend days in vape shops in France, and I convert smokers to vaping. And I saw so many smokers switching quite easily to vaping and stop smoking right away. That, to me, this is a real revolution in smoking cessation. So, as I said, people smoke for nicotine. Not only there are other substances in tobacco smoke that will increase the addiction to nicotine, but they die from combustion. And there's no combustion in vaping. Nicotine is not a carcinogenic substance. Nicotine is not a significant cardiovascular risk. Actually, the risk for cardiovascular system is mostly coming from carbon monoxide, which take the place of oxygen in the blood. That's the main risk. Nicotine is not a major or significant cardiovascular risk. And also, everybody, including smokers, are afraid of nicotine. Because for more than 3 years, in every anti-tobacco campaign, the culprit was not said to be the smoke, no. It's always nicotine. So everybody is afraid of nicotine. And particularly because the lethal dose of nicotine has been overestimated for many years. I will skip this one. You already seen it, but that's tobacco harm reduction in practice. What is nicotine? Nicotine is a simple, small molecule that you will find in many other vegetables that you eat every day. Nobody is naive to nicotine. Everybody is consuming nicotine at very low doses. But you have nicotine in tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, peppers, and so on. And nicotine is only one of the alkaloids that we can find in tobacco, but that's the major one, and that's the one that has the most action in the brain. I will not go through this slide, but just to mention that this lethal dose that we heard about for many, many years, that 30 to 60 milligrams of nicotine would kill an adult, is actually a fake news. And for many, many years, scientists have been trying to find where are these numbers coming from. And fortunately, a few years ago, Bernd Meyer, who is a toxicologist from Austria, finally found the source, because it was in old German books of medicine from 1850. 150 years later, we still believe those three physicians who tried nicotine on themselves and decided the little dose according to the wind. So, he calculated it based on the very, very few cases of committed suicide with nicotine. It's very difficult to die from nicotine, particularly if you ingest it. That's the wrong way. Once you ingest nicotine, at the first liver pass, 70% of nicotine will be discarded. So if you want to kill yourself with nicotine, certainly don't drink it. It won't work. So the lethal dose is at least 500 to 1,000 milligrams, not 30 to 60. And 500 to 1,000 milligrams absorbed, not ingested, because as I said, the oral route is not the good one. No, it's per kilogram of body weight, it's 6.5 to 13 milligrams per kilo. So nicotine is not the devil. But as I said, smokers fear nicotine. And as most vapors are ex-smokers, the vast majority of them, they still are afraid of nicotine. And that's a problem when you try to convert smokers to vaping if you work in a vape shop, for example, because you don't give them enough nicotine. So there is a need for educating vape shops. That's what I started 3 years ago in France. I thought that they had to know what is nicotine, what is nicotine dependence, what is tobacco dependence, how it works. And that, when they know that, they can help better smokers to switch. For me, vape shops are public health actors, not health professionals, but public health actors. Because if vapor products become the majority, there will be such a gain in public health that government will have to thank vape shops. And most of all, it doesn't cost anything to anybody. The smoker is paying for him or herself. What I learned from the field is that to switch correctly from smoking to vaping, you have to respect certain rules. One is that you need a device that provides a quite tight airflow, not a big bunch of vapor. For one reason. When you smoke, your throat is irritated. And when you take a puff on a vaping device, if you take a small puff, like many smokers will do at first, and then inhale a big quantity of air, the mixture of air and vapor is more irritating than pure vapor. So they have to learn how to vape. You know, what I do in this case, in a vape shop, I teach them. Here is how you should vape. Three seconds. Why? Because if you have a full mouth of vapor, glycerin, which is one of the components of the e-liquid, will soften the inhalation. It will be much easier than what most smokers will do first time. That's how it works. So you have to teach smokers to vape. That's essential. That's the first thing you should do. And most smokers, even some light smokers, will need high nicotine strength levels to switch to smoking. Even sometimes light smokers, because when a light smoker is smoking a cigarette, it's the same cigarette as a heavy smoker. So they have to feel something in the throat. And the nicotine level should be sometimes as high as you will put in a heavy smoker. There is no risk of overdosing by inhalation. Every smokers know that. When you had too much smoke at night, you just stop smoking. You're just fed up. And if you go further, you're nauseated. So there is no risk for that. They also have to know that vaping is slower than a cigarette to provide nicotine. What you obtain in 5 minutes in 10 puffs of cigarette, you will have to vape for 30 to 45 minutes to get the same. So as very often I say to a smokers, cigarette is a Ferrari. Vaping is a deux chevaux in France. You're going to the same point, but not at the same speed. And if you do both, very, very quick, your brain will go in the Ferrari and not in the deux chevaux. So a very important point too is to switch smokers as quick as possible. What I do in the field is that I tell them, try not smoking for 3 days. Vape as much as you like. And come back 3 days later and we'll make a point and we'll see if we need to adapt it or not. That's essential. I never encountered a dual user that never get back to smoking at some point. So switching should be quick. Don't worry about toxicity. When you use correctly a vaping device, you are in this red zone and there is no toxicity at all. It's only when you don't use it correctly that you can produce some toxic substances. There is no problem with secondhand vaping. A smoker can keep most of the nicotine of the propylene glycol and the glycerin. And this is very easy to demonstrate. You take a puff. And you keep it for a while. nothing comes out. Try to do it with a cigarette. It will not work. Yes, vaping can be used in pregnant women. In France, we are we're happy of that. We use NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, in pregnant women since 1999. We were the first country in the world to use nicotine replacement therapy in pregnant women. And thanks to UK, who followed very quickly after that, thanks to them to produce that little guide that is for health professionals, but that you can use in vape shops to give to pregnant women to reassure them. That's very important, to reassure the smoker anyway, any smoker. The first step in a vape shop is to choose the flavor. Choose the right flavor, that one that will keep the smokers trying to vape. So that's the first thing I do, and then trying to show them how to vape. For the nicotine dose, this is a table that I made, but I should say that most of the time I use the highest nicotine liquid I can with everybody, because we are limited in Europe to 20 milligrams per ml, and mostly you will find at best 18 milligrams when it's not 12 on most liquids. So, as a rule also, if I have a smoker of more than a pack a day, I recommend them to add a patch at the highest level to switch, because they will not they will not be able to get enough nicotine with 18 milligrams per milliliter e-liquid. And sometimes light smokers will also need high levels. Nicotine, when used out of combustion, is not as addictive as it is when smoking. Smoking is an addiction. Using nicotine by other route is, to me, it's a dependence. I make a clear distinction between addiction that could cause health problems to the person, but also the surrounding, and dependence. Everybody is dependent on something. Coffee, chocolate, smartphones. And when vapors get used to vape, they tend to reduce their nicotine level because they need less nicotine. And Lynn did a survey that is mentioned here, but others showed that despite the fact that vapors will tend to lower the nicotine too fast, they should be aware. What I say to smokers, don't go too fast. To me, smoking cessation will need at least a year. So don't go too fast reducing your nicotine, because you put yourself at risk. I will use simple device for starters. No need of big batteries and TFV8 atomizers. You need a tight airflow to switch people. And as I said, I do trainings in France. We are very lucky. We have a system in France that it means that for vape shops, doing the training costs nothing. Every employer has to pay to a fund every year for continuing education of whatever it is. Could be computer, could be... So every year they are entitled to train their employees. And so actually I do that. I'm paid by the vape shop, but they are reimbursed. So I'm in fact indirectly paid by the government to do what I do. So we're very lucky. I know it's not the same everywhere. And this is a list of many shops that I've trained in the last 3 years, including in Belgium and Switzerland. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Doctor. And I think later on in the discussion it will be very interesting to hear from the people in the field if this approach might be effective for the Netherlands too. Now we are switching to the UK. As we all know, the UK is the leader in e-cigarettes, as well as stimulating it by through the medical field and by the government. So it's very interesting for us to hear from Dr. Lynn Dawkins, assistant professor, London School, South Bank University, and a leading authority in e-cigarettes. Good luck.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you for inviting me here today. I hope you're all still awake, because I'm going to present you with some data, so you need to concentrate a little bit. So my name's Lynn Dawkins. I am a psychology researcher and lecturer at the Centre for Addictive Behaviours Research. Right. That way, isn't it? These are just my disclosures. Okay, so I'm going to start by giving a little bit of background about the policy situation, smoking prevalence and cessation in the UK, but I'm going to focus mainly on 3 areas. E-cigarettes for smoking cessation, use in young people, and e-cigarettes and potential health risks. So I'm going to draw on evidence from a variety of different sources, not so much on my own research actually for this presentation, because I wanted to give you an overview of what's going on in the UK, but mostly from the Smoking Toolkit survey and from the Public Health England evidence update published earlier this year. Okay, so in terms of policy, we actually have a dual route to market for e-cigarettes in the UK. So we subscribe to the EU Tobacco Products Directive, which became UK law in 2016, but we also have an alternative route to market, which is a medicinal route, which is a little bit more burdensome in terms of safety and quality standards required. However, going through this route would allow higher levels of nicotine above the TPD cutoff of 20 milligrams per milliliter, and it would also allow advertising and smoking cessation claims. However, we haven't had any manufacturers come through the medicinal route as yet, so we may do. It's quite a burdensome route, though. Okay, so let's look at smoking prevalence and cessation in the UK next. So these data are taken from the Smoking Toolkit survey in England. This is based on adults aged 16 and above. And you can see since 2007, there's been a slow but steady decline in the number of adults aged 16 and above who smoke. And this is echoed with the wider UK-based survey of adults aged 18 and above. The Office for National Statistics estimates that around 15% of adults currently smoke. So we're doing fairly well. And again, going back to the Smoking Toolkit survey data, more people seem to be making a quit attempt, and more people seem to be successful when they do. So you can see here, since the dip in 2011, that there's an increase in the number of people who are actually successful in their quit attempts. And that corresponds with around the time e-cigarettes were around, although of course we can't say that is the cause. Okay, so the first concern that is often expressed is that e-cigarettes just don't help people to stop smoking. So I wanted to focus on this and present a little bit of the evidence on that for you. So we certainly see in England anyway that e-cigarettes are the most popular method for quitting. So you can see the green line here shows that since 2011, e-cigarettes had a huge surge in popularity as the primary method for quitting, and at around the same time, use of other nicotine products, nicotine replacement therapy, kind of fell into disfavour for quitting. So although it may be the most popular method, how effective are e-cigarettes for quitting? Since 2015, there have been 14 systematic reviews published, and 7 of these included a meta-analysis. So that is where the data were pulled from various studies and combined for a larger sample size. And what we see from those is a completely inconsistent picture. So it doesn't clarify things at all. So first of all, we see 2 studies that showed a positive effect of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. Another 4 which showed no effect at all. And then 1 meta-analysis that showed actually people that used e-cigarettes were less likely to be successful at quitting. So why these inconsistent findings? So there's a number of reasons. Firstly, the types of studies that are included. So the top 2, the Rahman and the Hartman-Boyd, just used randomized controlled trials. So those are trials that are specifically designed to test whether e-cigarettes are effective for quitting smoking. The others, the other 5, included a much broader range of studies, including cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, that weren't specifically designed to test whether e-cigarettes can help people to stop, though they asked that question. Moreover, we can look at the types of participants that were included. So many of the studies that weren't randomized controlled trials included smokers and people who had tried an e-cigarette but not successfully quit with it, whereas people who had already quit with an e-cigarette were excluded at baseline. So that, of course, would automatically bias these studies away from finding an effective e-cigarette for smoking cessation. And finally, the types of outcomes included. So the length of follow-up varies considerably. How people who couldn't be followed up are treated as quitters or smokers varies also. In general, the Cochrane reviews of smoking cessation in the UK are held in the highest regard, and that is the Hartman-Boyd study here. So these have a very stringent inclusion criteria, only include studies that are designed to test smoking cessation, that is randomized controlled trials, that verify abstinence at follow-up and follow-up for more than 6 months. So I think we can be fairly confident in the results presented in this review, and that was updated in 2018 with similar results. So this RR of 2.29 here is the risk ratio. That tells us that roughly using a nicotine e-cigarette to quit approximately doubles or just over doubles the chances of successfully quitting. And that is fairly similar to what we see with other nicotine replacement products. It must be said, however, that there have only been 2 randomized controlled trials of e-cigarettes for smoking cessation. And these were very early studies conducted when e-cigarettes had only been around for a few years and weren't particularly effective products, the early cigalikes. And the products were even obsolete by the time the results were published. So we do need to wait. There are other randomized controlled trials in the pipeline using some of the newer devices, such as the one you've seen Jacques using, or the simple pen-like devices. So we await the findings from those. But in the meantime, we can look at other sources of information. And one such source is the data from the Stop Smoking services in England. So this is pooled data from a number of stop smoking services across England with a total sample size of almost 700,000. And these stop smoking services report 4-week quit rates. And you can see the different bars are various different types of interventions or combinations of interventions, most commonly NRT, nicotine replacement therapy, or bupropion and varenicline. So across all these studies, the average 4-week success rate was 51%. You can see using an e-cigarette only or using a licensed medication and an e-cigarette at the same time can increase that a little bit, up to about 57, 59%. And that's similar to the kind of quit rates that are seen with varenicline in the stop smoking services in England. Interestingly, combining using a licensed medication and then using an e-cigarette concurrently was associated with the highest quit rate, so it's 68%, so that looks quite encouraging. So overall, we can see some evidence that e-cigarettes can help smokers to stop smoking, but they're by no means a miracle cure based on the data that we've seen here. However, they are the most popular method, so even if they're only as good as NRT or a little bit better than NRT, because they're so much more popular, that means at a population level, that can result in a substantial number of extra quitters. And this is what Robert West and his colleagues have attempted to do, using data from the Smoking Toolkit survey. They have modelled, using 2 different methods, the number of additional long-term ex-smokers due to e-cigarettes over and above what would have happened anyway. So based on data from 2014, West and colleagues estimated somewhere between 16,000 and 22,000 additional quitters, long-term quitters due to e-cigarettes. Based on the 2015 data, using a different method, a time series analysis, the estimate was fairly similar, about 18,000 additional quitters. And the Public Health England report in 2018 also used the same methods as West, or varied a couple of assumptions about what would have happened anyway with the use of other alternatives, and came up with, based on data from 2016, that's somewhere between 22,000 and 57,000 extra long-term quitters due to e-cigarettes. So I think based on all of the evidence that I've quickly covered so far, we can conclude that e-cigarettes can be a successful method of quitting for many smokers. So the next commonly expressed concern is that young people may be using e-cigarettes who wouldn't otherwise have smoked, and then e-cigarette use is a gateway to smoking. So by using e-cigarettes, it causes them to start smoking. So what do we know about this? Well, again, drawing on data from the Smoking Toolkit survey, we can see that regular e-cigarette use in never smokers is extremely low. So that's the blue line along the bottom here. And actually, it's very similar to the use of NRT amongst never smokers, shown in green here. And by contrast, most use of e-cigarettes is in long-term ex-smokers, and the same is the case with NRT. But these data are from those aged 16 and above, and what we really want to look at is young people. So here we can see data from 5 different surveys across the UK. The different coloured bars represent different surveys which stem from different geographical areas and slightly different age groups, but overall these are 11 to 16-year-olds, with a huge sample size of over 60,000 in total. So if we look firstly at regular smokers, so these 2 columns at the end, ever use is pretty high in regular smokers, and more regular use, at least weekly, is fairly modest, between 7 and 38%. But what's particularly striking is here in never smokers, although there is some experimentation there, some ever use, if you look at more regular use, that is weekly or more, you can see that this is extremely low, at the highest 0.5%. And the same seems to be the case in 17 to 18-year-olds. Again, never smokers, regular use, that is weekly or more, seems to be extremely low. So these findings certainly seem to support the notion that e-cigarette use amongst young people is extremely low and limited to people who already smoke. What about trajectories, though? I mean, there have been 2 longitudinal studies from the UK and several from the US who have reported that young people who have never smoked but who have used an e-cigarette at baseline, when followed up a period of time later, were more likely to have gone on and tried a cigarette or tried smoking. And many of people have been very alarmed about this and started worrying that e-cigarette use is leading to smoking amongst young people. The first thing to say is that none of these studies have measured regular smoking. They've looked at ever tried smoking. So we simply can't conclude that ever using an e-cigarette at baseline causes regular smoking. But should we be alarmed? Even if using an e-cigarette precedes later trying a cigarette, this by no means suggests that there's a causal factor going on there. Even if one thing precedes another, it doesn't necessarily mean it causes it. And what's much more likely is a common liability explanation. That is, those individuals who are more likely to engage in risk-taking behaviour in one domain also are likely to engage in risk-taking behaviour in another domain. And there is, of course, evidence to suggest that actually e-cigarette use seems to be a gateway out of cigarette smoking rather than into cigarette smoking, and that's supported by data in 16 to 24-year-olds in England. We see a very slow but gradual decline in regular smoking amongst this age group. So this is not consistent with e-cigarettes leading to an increase in uptake amongst young people. Okay, and so the final kind of area of concern that's often expressed is e-cigarettes may be as harmful as smoking, and both Jacques and Carl have presented data saying that there's increasing number of people believing that e-cigarettes may be as harmful as smoking. So before I present the data, I just want to run through some considerations. Firstly, Jack has already said this, combustion is key. Cigarette smoke contains thousands of different compounds. When tobacco is burnt, there's thousands of compounds released, 70 are known human carcinogens, and tobacco is heated to about 800 degrees centigrade. In contrast, e-cigarette liquid is heated to around 200 degrees and contains far fewer number of compounds. So based on simple chemistry, we would expect e-cigarette or vaping to be safer. Some other things we need to bear in mind. Animal studies. We often see very strong conclusions made on the basis of animal studies, and we have to remember that there are important physiological differences between animals and humans, and the design of animal studies may not truly reflect the actual way that human users vape. So, for example, animals may be exposed to total body exposure. Cells in cell line studies may be bathed in liquid or again exposed for hours on end, which is not reflective of the way that human vapors actually vape. Even studies that use smoking machines to create vapor may not use realistic conditions and may not always test for the so-called dry puff phenomenon. Now, ideally, we would like to use human studies, but we can't wait for 20 or 30 years. If there are any harms, it would take a long time for those to develop. But we can look at biomarkers of exposure, so changes in cell function or metabolites of markers for risk of disease. Even these, however, we have to be careful because just about all vapors were ex-smokers. So even if certain biomarkers of exposures are identified in vapors, they could be due to prior smoking. So another thing to bear in mind. Other studies look at effects where we don't really know if that's clinically meaningful. Arterial stiffness, for example, it's unclear whether that is a marker of any subsequent disease. So the point I'm trying to make here is that we need to ensure across both human and animal studies that the exposure is realistic and that any effect that is being measured is actually a marker of disease or a marker of harm. So one example is NNAL. So this is a biomarker of exposure to nitrosamines, which are known potent lung carcinogens, can be easily measured in urine, and has relatively short half-life, so shouldn't be heavily influenced by years of smoking. So onto the data then. So these are studies of NNAL. There have been 8 studies. They're going to be presented on the x-axis in terms of how long it's been since the smokers have quit, since the e-cigarette users have quit smoking. These studies stem from a variety of different sources. Some of the participants had only recently stopped smoking and started using e-cigarettes. In other studies, they'd quit smoking for a number of years. And the y-axis just shows the percentage harm compared to tobacco smoking. So you can see across all of these studies, we're seeing a lower exposure to NNAL compared to tobacco smoking levels. And if you take the overall weighted average, there's a 91.4% reduction in NNAL levels compared to smokers. If you take these 3 studies out, because in those studies they were smokers that had only recently stopped smoking and using an e-cigarette, this reduces further to around 95% reduction. Other biomarkers include 1-HOP for pyrene, which is a carcinogen, 3-HPMA, which is a biomarker for acrolein, a known respiratory irritant, and carbon monoxide, which is known to be associated with cardiovascular disease. And again, across a number of studies, we see a reduction in levels of these biomarkers of exposure compared to tobacco cigarette smoking. But if you also map the levels seen in non-smokers, you can see that these are extremely similar. So there doesn't seem to be much cause for concern here. And Carl has already mentioned this. These are the types of data that have led Public Health England and the Royal College of Physicians to make their claim that e-cigarettes are approximately 95% less harmful. And this kind of statement is being increasingly endorsed by other medical institutions and public health bodies. For example, in the UK, Cancer Research UK, the biggest cancer charity, endorses this statement that e-cigarettes are far safer than smoking, and has developed this infographic to try and encourage smokers to switch. In terms of recommendations for stop smoking services, Public Health England recommends that stop smoking services should be offering support for those using e-cigarettes in a quit attempt. The National, I can never remember this acronym, the National Centre for Smoking Cessation and Training recommends that all stop smoking services are e-cigarette friendly. And then in the Tobacco Control Plan for England report published last year, it was stated that the evidence is increasingly clear that e-cigarettes are significantly less harmful to health than tobacco smoking, and the government will seek to support consumers in stopping smoking and adopting the use of less harmful nicotine products. So I just want to finish actually with 2 further quotes, and sorry they're lengthy ones, but this is, I think, a very important quote from the Royal College of Physicians report in 2016. If a risk-averse precautionary approach also makes e-cigarettes less easily acceptable, less palatable or acceptable, more expensive, less consumer-friendly or pharmacologically less effective, or inhibits innovation and the development of new and improved products, then it causes harm by perpetuating smoking. And we had a really clear example of this from the US in the last couple of weeks, when the FDA announced that it will pull e-cigarettes off the shelves if manufacturers can't demonstrate how they will stop this epidemic of use amongst young people. And that was associated with an immediate, huge surge in tobacco stocks. I think that says it all, really. And then finally, a major UK parliamentary inquiry that was published last month in the UK concluded that e-cigarettes present an opportunity to significantly accelerate already declining smoking rates and thereby tackle one of the largest causes of death in the UK. There should be a shift towards a more risk-proportionate regulatory environment where regulations, advertising rules and tax duties reflect the evidence of the relative harms of the various e-cigarette and tobacco products available. And Carl has already given an excellent example of how that could be implemented. So that's it from me. Thank you very much. Oh, some acknowledgements, sorry.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dawkins. I have some questions too, but I think the floor should be first. One technical question. Do doctors in the UK advise smoking patients to switch to e-cigarettes?
At the moment, because there are no e-cigarettes have gone through the medicinal route. They can't officially advise and they can't prescribe because there are no e-cigarettes licensed as medicines. And I guess just like other countries, GPs have very mixed views on e-cigarettes, and there is still a lot of GPs that don't have a very clear understanding. So although we're doing well in many domains in the UK, there is still a lot of misperceptions about harms, even amongst health professionals.
Just to add on this, I mentioned that I'm doing training for vape shops, but I'm doing the same training for health professionals as well.
Okay, thank you. Who wants to ask a question?
I would like to know if let's say the tobacco heat-not-burn products are better or not better than e-cigarettes with liquid.
Who wants to give an answer?
They are a tobacco harm reduction product, but as a scientist, I should say they are probably more toxic and probably less efficient to quit smoking because it's resemble too much to tobacco smoke. But they are effective. And they can be used like snus in Scandinavia. I mean, this is also a tobacco harm reduction product.
But they are promoted as better and safer.
They are safer than cigarettes.
We don't have the chance to promote e-cigarettes with liquid. Why everybody on the table says they are so low in harm. I mean, e-cigarettes are low in harm because I'm using it 12 years already. I was the first one who uses it, and I don't feel anything. So I think there should be some kind of regulator, or somebody should stand up and say, okay, can you prove that? Can you prove something?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is with heat-not-burn, they've been around for even less time than e-cigarettes, so we don't have a huge body of evidence. The Public Health England review published this year did include heat-not-burn in their report, and most of the published studies were from the tobacco industry. There were a couple of independent studies, but overall, as Jacques said, yes, they are a tobacco harm reduction product, much lower risk than tobacco smoking, but not as low a risk as e-cigarettes. Based on what we know so far. I'm not aware of any studies of smoking cessation from the heat-not-burn products, apart from Philip Morris' work in Japan. Their own work suggests that they are, and they're taking off in Japan.
Yeah, I've written on that too. I've researched it. The first studies seem to suggest that heat-not-burn, of course, is 2 or 3 times more toxic than e-cigarettes, but for staunch smokers, it's much easier to switch to heat-not-burn than to e-cigarettes. What do we think? One question from you. I have lots of them. Who wants to say?
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for your presentations. I'm very curious. In NRT, nicotine is always widely promoted as safe and safe use because it's hoe noem je dat nou? Een geneesmiddel. Yeah, right. So that's always good. But as far as I know, there's only one kind of nicotine. We're not having plans with one substitute the nicotine for NRT, and one is given nicotine for e-cigarettes. So I always wonder is how come there's not more pressure on that topic, because governments and public health bodies always are promoting those kind of tools, while the nicotine inside is the same. So,
thank you, Dr. Lund.
I'm a sociologist. I think Jack will provide the answer to such questions.
Yeah, you're right. It's the same nicotine. It's the same nicotine in NRTs and than in e-cigarettes. The problem is that e-cigarettes is a new product, even though it's been on the market for a while, and they've been lobbies against e-cigarettes, and the lobbies are obviously at the beginning the tobacco industry, even though they seem to go into a vapor product now. The pharmaceutical industry, because it was competing against NRTs, but it was also the government, because they have less revenue if people stop smoking. So that's the way. But I can tell you, we are scientists who wrote letters to the Commission, to the WHO, and so on, at the early phase of the Tobacco Product Directive, and we were never heard. We sent letters, we never had answers.
Sorry, just like to talk. It's interesting, the topic of nicotine as well, because there have been a few surveys in the UK and in the US about public perceptions of the harms of NRT, and I can't remember the exact figures, but there are many people who believe that it's the nicotine that actually causes cancer, and that is still a common belief. Even though NRT is a licensed medicine, people still have that belief, so we still need to educate people about nicotine.
I'm always hoping someday I can read research that get into that point, because it's always used as an. Oh, I'm sorry, I really have a bad day.
You're doing very well.
One question for Dr. Lund as a sociologist. You mentioned the word, I like that, working in the information field. There's an enormous information pollution, you said, concerning the difference between nicotine and tobacco and smoke. How might that be addressed?
Well, yes, I used the word thought pollution. I think it is thought pollution, really. We have tried to measure risk perceptions for quite some time now in Norway, where we ask smokers and non-smokers, GPs also, to assess the risk on snus, e-cigarettes, heat not burn, not been asked because that is not on the market yet, to compare the risk on these products, compare them to combustible cigarettes, and it's way out of scope here. While the panel of experts assess the risk of e-cigarettes to about 5%, snus at about the same, the smokers assess the risk as being 80% of the risk. So this really deprives them from a motive to switch. So I mean, we should have an obligation as public health informers to provide accurate information on risk, because that could provide a motive to smokers to switch this product and be really save lives. Well, I mean, yes, everybody. Well, I think that the best impact would be if authorities would be willing to do that. I have tried to approach the authorities, health authorities in Norway with my research, showing that smokers are so misinformed about these things. Different reactions. Some of them say, oh, your numbers must be wrong, because my impression is that people think that these products are risk-free. So they base their assumption on what they think. And some would say that, well, providing accurate information on these things would recruit never smokers to e-cigarettes, because then they will think that these things are risk-free, right? So they say, we will be willing to provide this kind of information, correcting misperception, if, but only if, this will not lead never smokers into vaping. And then they ask me, how can we do that? And my reply is that, well, one, we have to find a channel of communication that is going directly to the smokers and not to the never smokers. And that would be on the cigarette packs. So put information on risk difference on the cigarette packs. You will address directly to the smokers. Never smokers wouldn't see that.
I was very impressed, Dr. Dawkins, by the poster you showed, which I think was very clear, 4 or 5 points. Where can you see them in the UK?
The CR UK poster.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, it's getting that message out there, isn't it? I mean, that I haven't seen that poster anywhere other than on their own website. However, Cancer Research UK are doing a massive campaign at the moment in the north of the country, in the Manchester region, and they are displaying that information. I mean, I don't live in Manchester. I live in London, so I haven't seen it. But they are displaying that information a lot, and then comparing that to other regions in the north of England. We don't yet have any results of what's going on there, but they will be collecting data on cessation rates and prevalence. So, you know, we have to wait and see what happens as a consequence of that. But Cancer Research UK are one example of, you know, years ago at the beginning when e-cigarettes became available, they were very anti-e-cigarettes, but they have been very susceptible to the evidence, and they've kept their eye on the evidence, and they have come round and they have taken the bold step of being one of the first charities to endorse them and to release this kind of information.
Thank you. Question from the audience? Yeah.
Hi. First of all, thank you. I thought all 3 of the presentations were really good and useful. It might be a bit of a technical question, but what are your thoughts about bigger, generally direct lung devices running higher voltages, higher temperatures? They have been linked to an increase in formaldehyde production. Are they overall more harmful, or is that just hoax, so to speak?
Who?
I'll start and then I'll pass this on to Jacques, as he's more with me. Funnily enough, I put in an application to Cancer Research UK to explore that, and they rejected it. So I was hoping to look at it. I think that there is some concern that it may increase formaldehyde exposure. You see huge clouds of vapor, but I think because of the other settings are changed and the surface area of the coils can help to, you know, spread that temperature out more evenly. I think that may help, but I'm a psychologist. So I'll pass over to you.
Shortly, you will have the answer, because Konstantinos Vassilinos has been doing a study on that. Because the idea is, and that's what I showed with this graph about toxicity and the red circle. Whatever device you have, the power according to the resistance, you will always be in the range of 3.5 to 4.5 volts, whatever device you have. So basically, there will be no more toxicity. There will be more vapor. It's more difficult to use high level of nicotine. That's why I don't recommend it for starters. But that's why also advanced vapors consume much more liquid, because they use lower nicotine and they compensate. That's it. But to me, I wait for the results from Fassanino's studies, but basically there will be no difference, high power or low power, just depending on the couple between the resistance and the power.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something there. We have done some work looking at changes in the nicotine content in the e-liquid, and we have shown that when users who are regularly using high switch to low, without adjusting anything else, they do increase the amount that they puff, and then that can increase carbonyl exposure, although not anywhere near the levels of cigarette smoking. If users adjust from high to low and they're allowed to adjust the voltage as well, we still see the same thing. They're still compensated by puffing more and having higher voltage. So again, we see carbonyl exposure, and we've published 3 studies now showing that effect. Obviously, it's still far, far lower than tobacco smoking, but for e-cigarettes to be as least harmful as possible, we would advocate the use of higher rather than lower nicotine, because that means less puffing, consuming less e-liquid, and lower exposure to any potential toxicants that there may be.
And that's what I observed in vape shops. I always recommend people to don't lower your nicotine too fast. And to me, it's better to vape less at high nicotine level rather than vape a lot at low nicotine level. It's just common sense.
Thank you. Question from you?
Is there any information about the difference between nicosalts and nicotine?
Interesting. Is that you again, I think?
I think I'm the expert today. Well, basically, nic salts and nicotine base, it's still nicotine. It's just a question of irritation. Nic salts are the way nicotine is in the plant. When we extract nicotine to make nicotine patches or e-liquid, we use NaOH. What's
sodium hydroxide.
Okay, yeah. So it makes nicotine base. To make nicotine salt, you add a weak acid in it, and you have salts. Salts basically is just mixing a weak base with a weak acid. The result is exactly what happened with light cigarettes. The pH of light cigarette is lower than regular cigarettes. It's around pH 5 to 6. That's exactly what happened with nic salts, and that make it easier for people who are very much irritated, like people who has emphysema or COPD, to start vaping, because if not, then high nicotine level will be too irritant for them. So basically, it's the same.
I have a I'll come to you later. I have a question for Emil at Hart, because otherwise he is sitting there completely idle. I was impressed by the French story of experts going to the vaping shops and being paid by the government, if I understood you correctly. Would that be a model for the Netherlands, Mr. at Hart?
Well, that would be great if even the government acknowledged that it's a good product. And so, yeah, of course, it's very important. And we as a company do that ourselves. We train the people in the shops to explain how to vape, but it's it would be great if there's any funding. Funding is always good. Yeah.
Question over here.
Yeah, something about the nicotine salts. I've heard about that the nicotine salt, because the pH is lower, it damages the cell membranes in your lungs a little bit. I heard about some studies. Is that you heard about something about that, or?
No, I didn't heard about it, but what I can say, the physiological system in your lungs, you have a buffer substance in your lungs that will put nicotine in what form it, basic or acidic, right away at neutral pH. That's the case for any substances. That's also why I don't believe that nicotine salts are absorbed faster than regular nicotine. To me, there is no proof, no scientific proof, and I wait for that, but I don't believe it. I think, and that's the same for lower pH cigarettes. So, and there's no reason why nicotine salt will alter the pulmonary cells, because right away nicotine will be at neutral pH, and nicotine is nicotine, whatever the situation is.
Question for Dr. Lund. Speaking with people, researching this area, I got the feeling that there is often, at least in the Netherlands, a lack of compassion with staunch smokers. Staunch smokers have only the possibility to use e-cigarettes or heat not burn to get off smoking. And when you say that we have a famous lung cancer professor in the Netherlands, Wanda de Kanter, you all know her, of course. I once said this to her, and she refused to talk to me, which was for me some kind of acknowledgement. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, among the remaining smokers now, there is probably a higher relative share of what we call hardcore smokers. Those unwilling or unable to quit. In Norway, we have had snus on the market for decades. There is some willingness now among the GPs to advise hardcore smokers to switch to snus. Lately. E-cigarettes is still not available to the Norwegian market. Nicotine-containing e-cigarettes. You can buy the devices, but you have to go to Sweden to buy nicotine liquid. The government has decided to lift that ban and justify that by pretty much what is the ideology of tobacco harm reduction policy. So that is good. So I think this ideology of tobacco harm reduction is now being embedded in policy and also among the thinking of GPs in their clinical day-to-day business with patients. So I think now there's a willingness among GPs to advise hardcore smokers to switch to e-cigarettes and snus.
Question from the audience? You?
Again about liquid or the liquid salts. I heard that there were studies that the salt, the nicotine salts, when compared to the liquid, is less acceptable or less accepted by the body. So for normal liquid, about 20 milligrams. Is the same. You need 20 milligrams of salt, nicotine, to compare it with the e-liquid of 8 milligrams. That's the comparison they make. But is that true? Or?
No, that makes no sense to me. It makes no sense. Nicotine is nicotine. And I can give you a good example, which is the famous epidemic of e-cigs in the US about the Juul. Juul is working in the US because it is 50 milligrams per mil. Juul is coming to Europe, will be limited to 20, and will not do any better than any other nicotine salts in any pod. That's just the quantity that do the job.
I read in the New York Times last week on Juul, and they say because of the colors and because it's very flashy, it's more attractive for young people. What the New York Times?
Well, yeah, but still, if you look at the data, it's exactly the same as in the UK, and we have less data in France, but it's similar. And never smokers who use e-cigarettes regularly, and the point is regularly, not just trying it, is very, very low. It's below 0.5%.
More questions? Yeah.
Is there anything? Is there a difference between tobacco extracts and the imitation, let's say, tobacco liquids, e-liquids, which are being made? There's a lot of companies who make e-liquids with, let's say, pharmaceutical or imitation. How do you say that? E-liquid, and or you use tobacco extracts. The real extract, I mean.
Who?
The nicotine always comes from the tobacco plant, and it's extremely difficult to make synthetic nicotine, although it is possible, isn't it? But expensive and useless, right? So whether it's in patches or gum or e-liquid or in tobacco, it always comes from the tobacco plant. Do you want to add?
Yeah. Actually, we don't synthesize nicotine for one reason. If you synthesize a molecule, you will always have two pieces, two isomers. I need to show you. It's like your hand. They look alike, but they're not superposable. And one of the isomer of nicotine, the R or plus, is inactive. So only the S or minus is active in the brain. And tobacco is only doing the good one. So it's easier and cheaper to extract nicotine from tobacco rather than to synthesize it.
May I ask a provocative question to the three of you? In the vaping business, in the heat not burn business, there is very much a sort of defending nicotine. It's not as bad as we think, etc. You could do it also from another point of view. I go to scientific conferences every year, the AAAS in the US, for instance. I once watched a video there during a conference on the effects of nicotine on the brain. And there was this young guy, 17, 18, with Gilles de la Tourette. We all know Gilles de la Tourette, but this guy barked like a dog. He got a nicotine patch on his arm, and he was completely normal in a minute. So nicotine has very good effects for some people with mental problems, etc., on the brain. And one of the other professors told me that many pharmaceutical companies are now working for diseases like Alzheimer, etc., for nicotine-like substances. So, Dr. Lund, should we be more positive about nicotine instead of defending it?
Well, I don't know about being positive on nicotine, but what we can say is that the demonizing thing about nicotine has surely been wrong. I have been in tobacco control for 30 years, and 10 or 20 years ago, when we tried to make material convincing smokers to stop, we used what we could call the axis of evil. Nicotine was associated with the evil tobacco industry. Nicotine was associated with death and disease, smoking. And the same institution that used this axis of evil to demonize nicotine is now trying to separate nicotine from smoke and separate nicotine from the evil industry. That is difficult. And we have to thank ourselves for being in that dilemma. But I think it's reason to really rethink nicotine, and I think we have come a long way. And as Jack said, Michael Russell started this back in the 70s. And I think people like Jack and Lynn and Parsalinos and many other people here, they really started a rethink on nicotine that could end up in something saving a lot of lives.
One more question from the audience, or otherwise, I have because the famous Dutch lunches are waiting now. Broodje kaas. It's well known all over the world. I have a last question, thinking a little bit about Mr. at Heart, who is going to make a press communique later this day. Dr. Lund mentioned that we have 30,000 deaths in the Netherlands alone because of tobacco. What if the government would have a policy promoting cessation therapy, e-cigarettes, and heat not burn? How much lives could we save in the Netherlands? I start with you, Dr. Dawkins.
I have no idea. I haven't done any modelling work of that kind, but
A guess?
I'm aware of a couple of publications that have looked at the number of potential lives that we save, but I couldn't speculate. I think I'll pass it over to Carl.
Yeah, I can. There was a paper, I think this year, showing that if snus would have been available in Europe, for example, France is around 80,000 deaths per year. Since 30 years, when the snus ban came, it could have prevented, according to that paper, 30,000 deaths per year to France,
So
only.
that would be for the Netherlands 10,000 per year.
A third of it.
Yeah. But that's for snus. Yeah.
Yes.
What about e-cigarettes?
Snus is not more dangerous than vaping, basically.
Dr. Lund?
No, I think by including tobacco harm reduction policy into your tobacco control policy in Netherlands, I could imagine that you could very, very rapidly reduce the number of deaths here in our lifetime. I mean, the evidence base here is what we see from Sweden, where we have epidemiological evidence from snus use. And we can compare, as I showed you, compare the tobacco-related death in Sweden with what is the average in Europe. And it's way down. So I think you can expect to really have a rapid decline in smoking-related death if you included tobacco harm reduction policy into your politics, meaning making these products available, informing the smokers about the risk difference, and give them some risk proportionate regulation.
By 1/3? By 50%?
Wow. I'm a sociologist. I'm not good at numbers, but I think as a what was it?
It will take a few decades, I guess. But in the short term, you wouldn't see much of it, except for Orde Act, for example, or things like this. But after 10, 20, or 30 years, it will be the same as in Sweden.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you very much. Thank the excellent speakers. Maybe we should give them an applause. And thank you for asking the questions. It was an informative meeting, I think. And now the famous broodje kaas is waiting.